Hi friends, and welcome to our first episode in our next read-along series. We are kicking off this series with the first book in the Nightborn duology as a part of the Crowns of Nyaxia series by Carissa Broadbent. I am about a third of the way through the first book, The Serpent and Wings of Night, and before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about this whole universe of books as well as some other context about my journey with this book. If you are unfamiliar in Carissa Broadbent and this Crowns of Nyaxia series, I'll give you a little bit of an overview. So the Crowns of Nyaxia focuses on three houses. You have the House of Night, the House of Blood, and the House of Shadow. It's either the House of Shadow or the House of Shadows. And with that, her books focus around these different houses. So the first duology, it's called the Nightborn Duet, and it is about those in the House of Night. Then you have some books that are tied to the House of Shadows. So it's the Shadow, I think she calls it the Shadowborn books. I think that's also a duology. And then she has recently put out the first book in the Bloodborne duet, and that is about the House of Blood. In between the first two books of the Nightborn duet, you have a standalone book. And then after those three books are done, you have another standalone, and then you start the Shadowborn duet. The standalones truly are standalones. You don't have to read them, but she does map it out on her website that if you are going to read them, that you read them in that order. So you would read The Serpent and the Wings of Night, then a standalone, then the second book that goes with The Serpent and Wings of Night. That wraps up the Nightborn duology, but the first three books in this Crowns of Nyaxia. Then you have another standalone. Then you have the Shadowborn duology for the House of Shadows. When I picked up this book, The Serpent and the Wings of Night, I think it was because I had recognized the cover and I was familiar with Carissa Broadbent, but I had never read any of her work before and I wasn't that familiar with her. So I did not know everything that I just explained to you. I didn't know how big of a series it was a part of. I didn't understand that there were like all these duets inside this larger world, if you will. I didn't know any of that. So I had bought this book and I had read it. And then I realized that there was a lot more to this whole situation than I was aware of. So I shelved it for a while. And then fast forward to just recently when I have gotten to a place where I'm ready to pick up another book so I can do another read-along series. And I figured that I would pick this back up, mostly because I remembered liking it from when I had read it before. And I was curious about how things were going to play out with these characters. So I did commit to getting the standalone book as well as the second book in this duet. So while this series of episodes that's coming out is just about The Serpent and Wings of Night, I will then do a read-along series for the standalone as well as a read-along series for the second book in this duology. One thing I want to comment on that I want to clarify if it's been a little bit confusing, and if you haven't been listening so far and this is one of the first read-along series that you're joining, this may provide helpful context. But when I first started recording, I had called a read-along series a series for every book in whatever group that I was reading. So for example, if I was to read ACOTAR, I would have recorded as many episodes as it took for me to get through every single one of those books read-along style, and the whole thing would be a series of episodes from me. When I did that, it just felt really long. And although it is extremely likely that if you are somebody who is reading the first book, whether it is in a duology or in a trilogy or anything longer, that you are going to continue reading. It doesn't always happen. We know that sometimes things get DNF'd, but it is so highly likely that you would continue to read. So I understand how doing a series for all of the books together would make sense. But for me, it just felt like it made it a much longer process to get something finished, if that makes sense. Whereas if I have one book that is resulting in 3 or 4 episodes, that's a lot in and of itself to listen to, not only to read the book, but to, come and listen to episodes that are anywhere from like 30 minutes to over an hour, depending on the book or how much I've read or how many thoughts that I have. If you're doing that 3 or 4 times over, that is a lot. And I just feel like every book should be its own series because of that. And so I am switching the way that I am titling things. And for me, every book is its own series because there are many episodes that go into one book. It can be confusing because when I sit here and I say something like I'm reading the Crowns of Nyaxia series, but this is a series for the Serpent and the Wings of Night, you're mixing multiple books and the phrase series with multiple episodes of one book and me calling it a series. So I know that it is a little bit confusing, but I just feel like it makes it more digestible to think of each read along as its own series. You're going to get 3 to 4 episodes. That's roughly my average for any one book. And there could come a time where there is many more episodes than just 4 for a book. And so I want to give myself the ability to call each read along its own series because there is multiple parts to it. And then when we're talking about an actual book series and reading all of the books in that, I will either just do better to try to clarify, or I don't know, maybe my use of series will change, which seems kind of silly if I'm even spending any amount of time to explain it to you. But I just want to clarify because, again, if you ever go back to the earlier episodes I've posted and you hear me talk about a series, it's going to include many books for some of the early on read-alongs that I did, whereas now it's just a series per book. Now that we've given you the foundation of the Crowns of Nyaxia, the lay of the land of how many books are in that, kind of this wider universe that Carissa Broadbent has created, and then how I'm using language to speak about it, let's get back to this book. This is the first book in the Nightborn duology, which is the first duology in the Crowns of Nyaxia series. I have read about a third of the way through this book. It's funny how much feels familiar because I've read it before, but how much I forgot. And I think it was just because the minute that it's so silly to say, but the minute that I finished this book and I realized that there was much more to it, it's not that I just completely let it out of my mind, but I think that I just released myself from holding on so tightly to it because I just knew that if I was going to commit to reading all of her books in this Crowns of Nyaxia series, that I was probably going to have to start over anyway. Because here's the thing about me. Sure, it is entirely possible that I just read the duet, that I don't read the standalone, and that I don't read any of the other books in the whole Crowns of Nyaxia. I could just read those 2, and you could be done, and you could just walk away and call it good. Knowing me, I just knew that if I liked the writing and if I was resonating with the characters, that was never going to happen. I was going to want to read everything, and when I knew that there were standalones as well, I wasn't going to skip them. I wouldn't come back to them like they needed to be read in the order in which the author was saying to read them in. And so I just knew that I was going to commit to that. And so in this case, I've committed to doing that for these first 3 books. I don't own the rest of the books for the Crowns of Nyaxia. And if I really am coming away after finishing this book and refamiliarizing myself and then doing the standalone and getting through the second book of this duet, and I come away really feeling invested, then I will 100% continue. And I know I say that in a way as if there's a chance that I won't be invested, but I want to just allow myself to really take in and understand what this Nightborn duet is and this standalone book is, and give it a fair chance without the weight of the rest of the books, even though I know myself better than that and that I'm likely going to end up reading them all. All of that to say, the other thing I want to comment on really quickly is, as I was reading this book again, I realized that there was certain parts that I was still pretty confused about. And I think that that's a big part as to why when I originally read it, I wasn't fully bought in. It was because I was frankly a little bit lost. And when I was getting ready to record tonight, I was kind of running through some of the thoughts that I wanted to share. And I was just kind of lost. And I was like, okay, what the heck is the map of the world in which they're in? And, trying to like ground myself in stuff. Because here's the thing, there is a map at the beginning of this book, but the areas in which they're talking about and where in the city that the main character is and just all this stuff, I couldn't really get the lay of the land. And so when I had looked it up, which I don't know why I looked up the map, because I don't know what I expected to find, because the map is in the book and to me it's unhelpful. So I don't know what I thought that I would find, but of course I found Reddit, and I was treading carefully because I didn't want to have any spoilers, but the immediate thread that I was on was people talking about what I'm saying right now, of like, I'm confused. Like, I've read this, I feel like I'm a little bit lost, and other people were having very similar reactions to it. And then one person had said, I actually started to appreciate the lack of world building and the lack of context the more that I read the books, because it leaves it open that you can dive into each group when you get to its books. So again, this first duet is the Nightborn duet, and it's about the House of Night. Then you have the House of Shadows, and then you have the House of Blood. So what this user was saying is that you're going to just get to know the House of Night pretty well, and then you will move into the House of Shadows. And when you start to read these other houses' books, it will start to make a little bit more sense of how they all like relate to each other. So you get a broad understanding of these three houses and like what they mean and stand for. But that's really it. And you get more context and more of the lay of the land as you get into the books. And the user hypothesized that it also could be that it allowed for the author to have more decisions as she was writing other books than to commit to fully laying out everything about how these three houses interact with each other, everything about their histories, all of the nitty-gritty details early on, because then you have to stay committed to that. Obviously, I don't know if that's true. I haven't, like I said, I haven't watched interviews with her. I haven't looked up much about Carissa Broadbent or her history. She is just a very familiar name to me in the book world. And so I don't know how much of that stands, but it made a lot of sense what this user was saying. It made me feel better to know that I'm not the only one who's kind of confused and kind of lost. All that to say, we know that we have these three houses. We know that they live in this world together and are not all fans of each other. The last thing that I want to speak on before I dive into the chapters that I read is some background context, which if you've read the series, you will understand. But coming across this Reddit thread and hearing this was a helpful summary for me, and it's not a spoiler of anything. So I want to share it in case it's helpful for anybody who's reading the series now and who, like me, is a little bit lost. The House of Night is made up of like two factions. You have the Rishin vampires who have feathered wings, and then you have the Hyaj, which I don't know, and I assume I'm saying that wrong, and so I don't know that I'm saying it right, but you have the Hyaj vampires who have leathery wings. And in the current time in which you're reading the first book of the Nightborn duet, which again is the book that I'm on and that we're going to start to talk about, the Rishin vampires were overthrown. And so the Hyaj is the entity of vampires that are ruling the House of Night. And they're the only house that has these two factions that kind of go back and forth for power. Then you have the House of Shadows, which I don't remember off the top of my head what kind of magic exactly they have. And then you have the House of Blood, which is blood magic, and that entire house is cursed by the goddess Nyaxia. That I don't fully understand the curse, but essentially this blood curse ends up taking over you as a vampire, and it turns you into like this feral monster, which is these types of monsters are talked a little bit about in this book. But they are the only house that is cursed by the goddess. So now, finally, let's go ahead and dive into where I'm at. So, started reading The Serpent and the Wings of Night. I have paused at part 4, so I'm a little over a third of the way through the book. This book is a little over 450 pages, and so I'm about a third of the way through. When I think about how I want to talk about this book, the main character, of course, is one of the first things that comes to mind. Aurea is a human female main character, and it's kind of hard for me to describe how I feel about her. And I think I kind of felt this way when I first read this book. I don't want to say that it's because it's in comparison to such awesome female characters coming from an author like SJM. But I do have to be honest that when I've read this book both times now, as well as the first time that I read it, I was kind of in the thick of reading SJM. And so it's hard not to compare, right? You have to remember that when I'm doing these read-alongs, I'm reading multiple books at one time. And so I am always challenged with turning off my brain and setting aside any expectations for like writing style, approach, world building, all of that stuff in order to give the book that I'm reading the best chance. That's extremely difficult to do, but I think it also helps me be able to better articulate certain things, like why I'm feeling so lost, for example. Because yes, when you have a book such as something that SJM has written, where you get a lot of context and you get a lot of world building, even if you don't fully understand it all, it does then in comparison make you realize when you don't get that. But I don't know that I would have felt that way if I didn't have anything in such stark comparison. So all that to say, Oriah for me is an interesting character. I don't know that she is on the top of my list as being one of my favorite female main characters right now. I think that what we see so much of from her is fear, and that is in stark comparison to how much of a fighter she is, how fierce she is, how powerful she is, even though she's human. But it's always coming from a place of like protecting herself and from survival. I understand why, because she's a human living in a world of vampires and she's been raised in that world. So she's always like, she's been raised to be on her guard the entire time. But as much as that is a big part of us knowing her, I just feel like there's layers there that I want to peel back. But here's the thing. I think is especially that way, and I think it's actually meant to be that way, because she herself doesn't know herself, because she has such a big piece of her story missing. She doesn't know who her family was. She doesn't know who her parents were. We know in this story that when she was found, her memories were of going to bed, and there was other like I think she says something about like little feet got out of bed and were walking around right before everything kind of like went to hell. So you can assume that there was other children around. Let's say that they were siblings. She had a family by all accounts, and they are nowhere to be found, right? She was raised by the vampire who saved her, who is the king of the House of Night. And so she doesn't have that whole part of her identity. And so I think that us not being able to really pinpoint her down is also a direct reflection of her not being able to know herself well. I don't know that she realizes it yet, though. I think that she probably thinks she knows herself very well, and I think that she does. But it's almost like you don't know what's missing until you face it. I say that loosely, though, because she does talk about missing her family and wanting to see them. That's a big motivating factor for her, is like trying to go find them or at all figure out where she came from and try to see if she can get any context. So she is very much motivated to find them, and so she's very acutely aware of what she's missing. But I think that's so wrapped up in her identity of like being this fighter and being this survivor to find this truth, that there's still layers there that she definitely doesn't know about herself, and therefore, we feel that as a reader. What I do find interesting is, even though she has come across a couple of different women in this story, there are other characters that are female that she's fought or that she's allied with. There is a lot of male presence around her. And why I say I find that interesting isn't because I'm lacking male presence with other female main characters. That's not at all the case. This isn't anything new. But there's something about the fact that it's her and the Nightborn King, and we center on their story so much that just makes it feel like a much more masculine tale. And that makes perfect sense, because she was saved by the king. She was raised by the king. He's trained her. He's a huge character in this story. He's prominent to everything that she is and to everything that she's fighting for. He's obviously the king, so he has a lot of power. That dynamic of like him being involved and it having this kind of masculine air makes a lot of sense because she doesn't have a notable female presence in her life. And the little bit that we got from her friendship with Ilana, she was kind of a rough and tough woman. So you weren't getting this motherly vibe. And there was one small part in the book, in one of the recent chapters actually, from where I stopped, where she mentions that like she like yearns for this mother and like she wants that role in her life and she just obviously doesn't have it. That's what I mean when I think that there's a little bit more to her that even she, it's like she knows is there, but she hasn't fully uncovered yet. And that definitely would come in like the softness of having people love her and comfort her and be there for her. Because as much as the king, whose name is Vincent, has been there for her and cared for her and loved her in his own way, it's not driven by like affection and softness. It's driven from a place of survival because he knows that she's weak in comparison to the vampires and she has to literally fight to survive. And I think that maybe that masculine energy, it adds to it being a little bit hard to like pinpoint her. Like we know that she's kind of this rough and tumble woman. She's not very girly because she owns it and she says that she's not. But it just feels like there's so much to her that is left to be discovered, even though we're getting a very strong and confident and powerful woman in her character. There's a lot that is going to come from her story and from her, and that I think will evolve her as a character that we haven't gotten to yet. Outside of those observations about her, based on this whole idea of the challengers, like living in a shared space, going to these different arenas to have different challenges and battles, it very much reminds me of the Hunger Games. And Ilana reminds me of the costume designer in Hunger Games that helped Katniss, who, spoiler alert, he ends up passing away because those who are in charge of the challenge ends up like attacking him as she's getting ready to like leave for the very first time. And you just know that he doesn't make it out of that situation. So when you see in this book that Oriah is put into this house with all of these people when this whole overall like tournament thing starts, and she knows that Ilana's in the house, it very much feels the same way. The one thing I will say about that, though, is that not every contestant in this book had somebody that was close to them that was put into this house when they first started in this tournament. I think Ilana was put there because she is a human that would give blood to the vampires and was kind of like, servant isn't the right word, but I don't have a better word. But because she was like in the circle of people and they don't really value human life, even though they say that, you know, humans and vampires alike are all created from and like under Nyaxia, the goddess. The vampires obviously see themselves as superior to humans. So I think just because of Ilana running in like these circles with the Nightborn vampires, she just kind of inadvertently got herself put into this place. I don't think it has anything specific to do with Oriah, but we're gonna keep that as a but because there could be something to that. And maybe, you know, maybe that'll be talked about later on. But it was pretty quick from when you're introduced to Ilana to when she's no longer with us. And it's a bummer because I really liked her as a character and I would have loved to see where she would have evolved to. And it would have been really interesting to see her, if Oriah came out of the other side of this tournament, what, you know, Ilana would have to say about it and all this kind of stuff. So sad that she didn't make it through, but I know that she's an important character because when Vincent first sees Oriah after this whole thing kicked off, before the first trial had begun, there was already a lot of like scuffle and kerfuffle because when everybody got put in this house, they all kind of like panicked at first, right? Because it just happened on the drop of a dime and they were all trying to like fend for themselves and just find a safe haven and whatever. So there was some skirmishes and she got hurt and she when she found Alana's body, she grabbed some of her fabric and used it to bandage herself. So when she saw Vincent and he sees this on her hand, he asks, like, where did you get it? And she says, I just found it in the house. I think that she is going to play a much greater role to Oria's history than Oria knows at this present moment. And I think that Vincent will have known about it, and Oria will come to find out that Vincent knew about it. And even though Vincent didn't know that Oria and Alana were that close, I think she's going to be more involved than just happening to be a human that was giving blood to the vampires that ran in like the circles of the House of Night. It's going to be much deeper than that. And those are the little nuggets that I'm kind of keeping my eyes out for as I am reading, trying to learn like what Carissa's writing style is and how she, you know, if she's dropping little hints and are there little nuggets to hold on to for later. I don't know. But I am going to stash that one away in case Alana plays a bigger role in this whole thing and we come to find that out later. Outside of that, what we have really also started to see is this alliance that Oria has made with Rain and with Mish. You come to know that Mish and Rain are not cut from the same cloth. Their backgrounds are not the same. They, so far up until this book, you know enough to know that that is true, but you're not exactly sure how they came to be. Like, Mish talks to Oria at one point and says, like, he was there for me when nobody else was. But up until where I've read, we don't exactly know what she means by that. And we also are starting to get to know Rain better. And we know that he is a human who was a turned vampire. So it's going to be interesting to uncover more of his story, because even though I've read this book, I'm talking to you about it as if I haven't read it, because I literally did. I put everything out of this story out of my mind. I really held on to very little. It will be interesting to really see where his story goes, because he's already set up to be somebody unique, right? Not only the fact that he's a human who's turned, but he didn't fully give in to the whole vampire ways. Like, he's not as clean cut and he's not as polished. And we obviously know why, because of the fact that he has his human heritage. But I think that in books like this, especially when they're defining not only different groups of vampires, but really kind of speaking about all of them as being like pretty polished and together and like rigid, because again, vampires live for centuries and just many, many, many years. They kind of become these creatures of habit and very lethal and like cunning. He is a lot of that, but he's also not your cookie cutter vampire. And anytime that characters like that pop up in this world that is so defined by like rule and expectation, those are the ones that become the most dangerous, and often in the best ways for the main character because they're allies. And we're already starting to see this allyship of Rain and Oria. Granted, it's for survival in this tournament, but again, if I know anything about kind of the formula that makes for this type of fantasy writing and romantasy, if you will, is that he's not just going to be an ally now, he's going to be one for the foreseeable future, if I had to guess. It's going to be well beyond what this tournament is, because even recently in one of the chapters I had just read, she is like pressing him about why he like wants to ally with her and all this stuff. And he is just giving her shit, but they're like having this conversation, and he like pauses because he says something about like that look, like your face is just, and he like pauses and whatever, and he doesn't fully go there. And it's the first time that we start to see a little bit of vulnerability where you're starting to realize that like his humanity is peeking through, and it's kind of that like innocent boyish charm a little bit. And obviously she's human, so it's not tension. I wouldn't have defined it as such, because they're still very like distant from each other, because after all, they're supposed to be enemies and they're supposed to be trying to be the only survivor in this whole tournament. But because of their allyship with one another, you're starting to see the walls come down very, very small bits at a time, but you're getting these little breadcrumbs of what could be a future entanglement, a future like lover situation, very much them being the long-term story out of this whole Nightborn duet. And so I'm just interested to see how he evolves as a character and how that evolution and how, as we learn more about his history, how that impacts the experience that Oriah has. Other than that, I will say that I don't really have a lot of strong thoughts. Like, the chapters so far, for being a third of the way through the book, we've gotten a lot, right? Like, we understand that there's these 3 houses. We understand that this tournament is happening. We understand Oriah's motivations for doing it. She wants to get power. She wants to be able to not be this defenseless human in this world of vampires. And she's accepted that being a vampire and having power would be the best thing for her, so she's not so frail and fragile in this world full of predators and enemies, even though the literal last thing that she wants is to be a vampire. But she ultimately also wants to have enough power to go find her family and see where she comes from, which is interesting to me because if any people from her family are still alive, but she ends up becoming a vampire to have enough strength to go find them. It's not that she can't be at peace with them, but it's not the most natural thing for humans and vampires to be kosher with one another. So I'm wondering how that would all actually go down, and if anybody in her lineage is alive, what they would think about it, because the whole war between the Rishans and the Hyaj vampires is what decimated the place that she came from and why she was left by herself and how the king found her. I would imagine that they have a lot of hatred towards vampires. And so if she was to become one, even if her motivation was to find them, I just don't see that going well. There's also a part of me that just feels like she might not get that far in that journey. I don't know. It could be a whole other thing for her to actually even go down that road and actually find out who her family is. I don't know. I don't know that I see a lot of good things coming out of that, but I think that her past is the key to her future in terms of how she's going to evolve as a character and what this story is going to be. So I know we're going to have to revisit it no matter what. My overall point of what I was getting at is that I don't feel like there's a ton, right? There's a lot happening. She's in this tournament. She's going through these trials. She's trying to get this power so she can, find her past. The Night King is obviously around, and he's always dealing with some amount of political pressure or something because he's maintaining a kingdom after all. So we don't know exactly what's happening, but we know some shit's going down in the background. And then we have, this allyship of her with Mish and Rain as they're in the middle of this tournament. So a lot of activities happened, a lot of fights, all this kind of stuff. But I also just feel like we're getting there slowly but surely through her story, but not a ton has happened. Yet I felt like it was important for me to record because of being a little bit lost of just, again, where exactly certain things are in this land and what exactly is everyone's tie to each other. So again, going back to that Reddit thread, it makes me feel a little bit better to know that I'm not the only one who has been confused in starting this story. Obviously, I just have to persist and see what, more kind of pieces together as I find out more information. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing to come back into the world of vampires and for it to kind of be set up this way. And what I mean by that is one of the earliest series that I remember getting into when I was in my early days of being an avid reader was Twilight. And that was exactly for my age group, and I was the demographic, and, read all of the books and went to and saw all the movies. And that is just a very different type of vampire story. And I really haven't read anything in relation to vampires ever since. A lot of fantasy, but none of them have really tied to vampires being this central entity. And so it's interesting to be reading a book where humans and vampires coexist, but not at all as equals, which not that they really did in Twilight, but they kind of did. But yeah, not really feeling like it's in modern day, very much has this at war, we need to protect our own kingdom and our own clan of people type vibes. I don't know how I feel about it. I'm open to vampire stories, obviously, because I'm reading it, but I'm interested to see if my appreciation of this type of world and these characters grows by the time that I get through this book and certainly into the standalone and into the second book of this duet. And I guess I say that because I really do want to like it. I want to open myself up to, I guess for a lack of a better term, being a fan and open to vampire-based stories. I just don't know if this is the one that's going to get me to, I don't know, I guess I'm so used to being in the fantasy world of like dragons and fae and like demons and stuff that the vampire stuff has been sat for so long for me that it's kind of weird to get back into it again, I guess, and for it to be in this way. But yet the approach again of there being like power and kingdoms and battles is very familiar to a lot of the fantasy that I've already read, coming off of Fourth Wing and SJM and all that. But yeah, I don't know. Being in a very vampire-centered story is kind of odd for me. So I want to obviously continue. I hope that things really pick up and that I have a lot more to say and to share as I read through this book. I have a feeling that this is going to probably be a 3-episode book unless some stuff really pops off and I want to do 4 episodes. But I think, yeah, that this series for this first book and this duet is going to be 3 episodes. And we'll just have to see how this story carries forward and what happens with our main character, Oriah. So as always, I thank you all for coming to listen to these read-alongs as you're reading the books. I am interested to hear what you think of the characters so far. If you're really loving this, if it's taking you a little bit more to get into it, like whatever it is that you're thinking and feeling, please share your thoughts on YouTube and let me know where you're at and what you think is going to happen and what's going to come for these characters as we go forward. So again, appreciate you being here and following along. And until next time, friends.